Good evening, and welcome to this quiet corner of the past. Tonight, we drift back through centuries to a time when winter was not a season managed by thermostats and insulated walls, but a patient adversary, one that tested the limits of human ingenuity, endurance, and spirit. On the frozen plains and in the deep forests of North America, nights could fall like a silent weight, colder than memory itself. The peoples who lived there, the Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Blackfoot, and countless others, faced winters that stretched for months, where darkness came early and the wind carried voices of ice. This is not a story of conquest or battle. It is something quieter, something more intimate, a glimpse into the daily rhythms of survival, the small technologies of warmth, the spiritual beliefs that made cold nights bearable, and the social structures that determined who slept soundest when the temperature plummeted. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd ask a small kindness of you. If this gentle passage through history brings you comfort, tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these late-night explorations will always find you. Leave a comment below, tell me where you are in the world right now and what hour it is where you rest. Some of you may be wrapped in the stillness of deep night, others greeting the first light of morning, or somewhere in the soft hours between. Now settle yourself comfortably. Perhaps dim the lights around you or let a gentle fan hum in the background, that soothing white noise that softens the edges of consciousness. Let us begin this quiet journey together. Let us drift back to a time when warmth was earned, not assumed, and when every winter night was a small victory of fire over frost. You are standing at the edge of a vast prairie, somewhere in what will one day be called the Northern Great Plains. The year does not matter. It could be 1650 or 1450 or even earlier, because winter here has always been the same. The sky above you is a pale, bruised grey, the kind of colourless dome that promises snow but offers none yet. You can see your breath, a small cloud that forms and dissolves with each exhale, and you have learned not to breathe too deeply through your nose when the air bites like this. You are not a chief, not a medicine person, not anyone of particular note. You are simply a member of your band, a daughter, a son, a cousin, someone whose name is spoken around the fire but not carved into legend. Your people move with the seasons, following the buffalo, gathering what the land offers, and when winter comes you settle into a place where the wind is less cruel and the firewood more plentiful. This year your band has chosen a river valley where cottonwood trees cluster and the hills provide some shelter from the north wind. The sun is already low, though it is barely mid-afternoon. Winter days are short here, and the light that remains is thin and cold, as if the sun itself has lost interest in warming the earth. You have been gathering firewood since morning. Your shoulders ache from the weight of the bundles strapped to your back, dead branches mostly, because green wood smokes too much and gives little heat. Your hands are wrapped in scraps of hide, but the cold has found its way through and your fingers feel stiff, clumsy. You have learned to move carefully when your hands are like this, because a clumsy hand drops things, and dropping your firewood means bending to retrieve it, and every unnecessary movement steals warmth from your body. The snow underfoot is not deep yet, but it is enough to make walking slow. Each step punches through a thin crust of ice, and the cold seeps up through the soles of your moccasins, which are lined with dried grass and fur, but still cannot keep out the persistent chill. You think about the tipi waiting for you, your family's shelter, a cone of buffalo hides stretched over a frame of long poles. It is not large, and it is not particularly warm, but it is better than nothing. And tonight, as every night, you will be grateful for it. As you approach the camp, you see smoke rising from several teepees, thin grey columns that climb lazily into the sky before the wind catches them and pulls them apart. The smoke is a good sign. It means the fires are burning, and fires mean warmth, however fleeting. Your teepee stands near the center of the camp, its entrance facing east, as tradition demands. The hides that cover it are old, patched in places, and you can see where the wind has worked its way beneath the edges, lifting them slightly, letting the cold creep in. Inside, the space is dim, the only light coming from the fire pit in the center, and the pale glow that seeps through the smoke hole at the top. The air is thick with smoke, not enough to choke you, but enough to sting your eyes and coat the inside of your throat. Your mother is tending the fire, adding small sticks, one at a time, carefully, because firewood is precious and must be rationed. She glances up as you enter, and though she says nothing, you see the relief in her eyes. Relief that you have returned, that you have brought more wood, that the fire will not go out tonight. You drop your bundle near the fire and sit down, pulling your robe, a heavy bison hide, brain-tanned and softened, around your shoulders. The warmth from the fire touches your face, but your back remains cold, and you know that this is how the night will be. A constant negotiation between the fire's heat and the creeping cold that presses in from all sides. Your siblings are huddled together on the far side of the teepee, wrapped in their own robes, their faces barely visible. One of them is coughing, a dry, harsh sound, and you feel a flicker of worry because illness in winter is dangerous, and a body weakened by sickness cannot fight the cold. The floor beneath you is covered with willow mats and dried grass, and beneath that, the bare earth. It is not soft and it is not warm, but it is what you have, and you have learned to curl your body in ways that minimize contact with the ground, to keep as much of yourself in the air, where the heat from the fire can reach you. Your father is repairing a pair of moccasins by the firelight, his hands moving slowly, threading a bone needle through tough hide. His fingers are thick and scarred, and he works without speaking, his face blank, his attention focused entirely on the task. You watch him for a moment, and you think about how much of winter is like this, small, repetitive tasks done in silence, done over and over because there is no alternative. Moccasins wear out, and they must be repaired because bare feet in winter mean death. Your grandmother sits near the fire, her face deeply lined, her eyes half closed. She is wrapped in layers of hides, and still she shivers, her body too old to generate the heat it once did. You have seen elders die in winter, their bodies simply giving up, unable to endure another night of cold. It is not dramatic, not sudden. They simply grow weaker day by day until one morning they do not wake. The fire crackles softly, and you lean closer, letting the heat soak into your skin. But you cannot sit too close because the smoke is worse near the fire, and breathing too much of it makes your head ache. This is the paradox of winter nights. You must choose between warmth and breathable air, between the sting of smoke and the bite of frost. There is no perfect solution, only a constant adjustment, a balancing act that lasts until dawn. Outside, the wind picks up, and you hear it sliding over the teepee, a low, mournful sound. The hides rattle slightly, and a draught slips through the entrance, stirring the fire and making the flames dance. Your mother reaches for a hide that hangs near the entrance and adjusts it, trying to block the draught. It helps, but not much. The cold is patient, and it will find its way in eventually. You think about the meat hanging outside, frozen solid in the night air. There is not much left. Winter has been long, and the hunting has been poor. Your stomach is not full, and it has not been full for weeks. Hunger is a constant companion in winter, a dull ache that never quite goes away. But hunger also makes you sleepy, and sleepiness is a mercy, because sleep means you do not feel the cold as much. You have learned to welcome the heaviness that comes with an empty stomach, the way it pulls you down into unconsciousness, where the cold cannot follow. Your mother ladles out a thin stew from a pot near the fire, mostly water, with a few scraps of dried meat and some wild roots. It is hot, and that is what matters, the heat of it spreading through your chest, warming you from the inside. You eat slowly, savoring each mouthful, knowing that this is all there will be until morning. The warmth of the stew is brief, but while it lasts, it feels like a small miracle. When the meal is finished, your mother banks the fire, covering the coals with ash to slow their burning. The flames die down, and the tipi grows darker, colder. This is the most dangerous part of the night, the hours when the fire is low, when the cold presses in with renewed strength. Someone must stay awake to tend the fire, to add wood when the coals begin to fade. Tonight, it is your father's turn. He settles himself near the fire, his robe pulled tight, and you see the weariness in his face. The weariness of a man who has done this too many nights, who knows there are many more nights to come. You lie down, pulling your robe over your head, and curl into yourself, trying to trap whatever warmth your body can generate. Beside you, your siblings are already asleep, their breathing soft and steady. The ground beneath you is hard and cold, and no matter how you position yourself, you cannot escape the chill that seeps up from below. Your hips ache, your shoulders ache, and you shift constantly, trying to find a position that does not hurt. Above you, the smoke drifts up through the smoke hole, and beyond it, you can see a few stars, cold and distant. You watch them for a moment, and then you close your eyes. Sleep does not come easily. Your body is too cold, your mind too aware of the discomfort. But eventually, exhaustion wins, and you drift into a shallow, restless sleep, the kind where you are never fully unconscious, where every sound, the crack of the fire, the rustle of hides, the cough of your sibling, pulls you partway back to wakefulness. You dream, but your dreams are cold and fragmented, images of snow, of wind, of endless walking through white emptiness. You wake several times during the night, each time colder than before. Your father is still awake, feeding the fire, and you watch him through half-closed eyes, grateful that he is there, that the fire still burns. Near dawn, you wake again, and this time you notice frost on the inside of the teepee, tiny crystals clinging to the hides. Your breath has frozen in the air, condensed on the walls, and now it glitters faintly in the dim light. Your eyebrows are stiff with frost, and when you reach up to touch them, your fingers come away damp. You have slept in your own frozen breath, and the realization is both strange and oddly familiar. This is what winter mornings are like. Outside, the world is still dark, but there is a faint lightening in the east, a suggestion that the sun will return, though it will bring little warmth. You lie still for a moment, reluctant to leave the small pocket of warmth you have created beneath your robe, but staying still means staying cold, and eventually you force yourself to sit up. Your body protests, every joint stiff, every muscle tight. Your mother is already awake, coaxing the fire back to life, adding small twigs until the flames catch and grow. The warmth is immediate and precious, and you move closer, holding your hands over the flames until feeling returns to your fingers. This is how winter mornings begin, slowly, painfully, with the cold reluctant to release its grip. You will spend the day moving, working, trying to stay warm, and tonight the cycle will begin again. You do not complain, because there is no point. Everyone is cold, everyone is tired, everyone is hungry. This is simply what it means to be alive in winter, and you have learned to endure it day after day, night after night, until the season finally breaks and the world softens again. But spring is far away still, and there are many more nights like this one ahead. You pull your robe tighter and stare into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. For now, this small circle of warmth is all you have, and it will have to be enough. There was a man named Black Elk, born in the winter of 1863 among the Oglala Lakota, and his earliest memories were of cold, not the sharp, sudden cold of a winter wind, but the deep, pervasive cold that settles into bones and stays there, the kind of cold that becomes part of your understanding of the world. He was born in a tipi, as all children of his people were, and the first air he breathed was thick with smoke and the smell of burning buffalo chips. His mother wrapped him in soft hides, and for the first months of his life, he knew warmth only as something stolen from her body, a borrowed heat that faded the moment she set him down. The teepee poles rose like dark fingers against the winter sky, their tops converging at a point where smoke escaped in thin grey threads. Inside, the space was smaller than it appeared from without, the walls sloping inward, creating a cone of sanctuary against the elements that howled beyond. Winter was the backdrop of his childhood, not because winters were unusual, but because they were so constant, so defining. The rhythm of his early years was measured by the passage of seasons, and winter was always the longest, the hardest, the one that tested whether you were strong enough to see another spring. His family's teepee was not large, and in winter it grew crowded. He slept between his siblings, their bodies pressed together beneath heavy robes, and he learned early that warmth was a communal thing, something you shared or lost. The robes were made from buffalo hide, tanned until they were soft and pliable, and they carried the faint smell of the animals they had once covered. When he pressed his face against them in the darkness, he could imagine the buffalo themselves, their massive forms moving across summer grasslands, and this thought gave him comfort. His mother would bank the fire at night, covering the coals with ash so they would burn slowly until dawn. In the darkness, he could hear the breathing of his family, each person a separate rhythm, and together they formed a chorus that was more reassuring than any lullaby. The fire pit sat in the center of the teepee, stones arranged in a careful circle to contain the flames. Throughout the night, someone would wake to feed it, adding small pieces of wood or dried dung, and the fire would flare briefly, casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. On the coldest nights, his grandmother would tell stories, her voice low and rhythmic, and he would listen with his eyes closed, imagining the worlds she described, worlds of creation and trickery, of animals who spoke and spirits who walked among the people. The stories distracted him from the cold, made the hours pass more quickly, and he came to associate the sound of her voice with a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with fire. She told him of Iktomi the spider, who was clever but often foolish, whose schemes would backfire in ways that made the children laugh. She told him of the white buffalo calf woman who had brought the sacred pipe to the people, who had taught them the ceremonies that connected earth to sky. She told him of the thunderbirds, those great spirits whose wings made the sound of storms, whose eyes flashed lightning across the summer plains. In winter, she said, the thunderbirds slept in the west, and that was why winter was silent, why the sky seemed heavier, more oppressive. His father was a respected man, a hunter of skill, and in good years he brought home enough meat to keep the family fed through winter. But even in good years there was never abundance, only sufficiency, and Black Elk learned to eat slowly, to make each mouthful last, because he did not know when the next meal would come. The meat was dried in thin strips during autumn, when the hunting was good and the air was dry enough to preserve it. These strips hung from the teepee poles like dark ribbons, and throughout winter they would be boiled with roots and berries to make a stew that sustained the family through the lean months. His mother was skilled at making the food last, at stretching each meal so that everyone ate something. She would add water to the stew until it was thin, more broth than substance, but it was warm, and warmth in the belly was better than nothing. There were winters when the buffalo did not come, when the herds moved elsewhere or were too few, and those winters were different, quieter, heavier, marked by a tension that even the children could feel. He watched his parents' faces during those times, saw the worry they tried to hide, and he understood, in the way children understand, that winter could kill. The camp would grow quieter during these difficult winters, the usual sounds of laughter and conversation replaced by a watchful silence. People moved more slowly, conserving their energy, and even the dogs seemed to sense the shortage, lying near the fires with their ribs showing beneath their fur. The elders would gather to discuss where the buffalo might have gone, whether the band should move to search for them or stay and wait for smaller game. These discussions could last for hours, each man speaking in turn, and Black Elk would listen from the edge of the circle, learning the weight of such decisions. When he was 4 or 5, old enough to remember but not old enough to understand, a relative died. He did not know what illness had taken them, only that one day they were there coughing and weak, and the next day they were wrapped in robes and carried out into the snow. He remembered the singing, the low, mournful chants that accompanied the body, and he remembered the way his mother cried, silently, her face turned away. He did not understand death yet, but he understood loss, and he understood that winter made loss more likely. The body was placed on a scaffold high enough that wolves and other animals could not reach it. The scaffold stood on the edge of camp, visible against the white landscape, and for days afterward he would glance toward it, half expecting the person to return. His grandmother explained that the spirit had gone to the other world, that the body was just a shell now, empty and meaningless, but he could not stop thinking about the cold, about how the body would freeze up there, alone under the winter sky. The Lakota moved often, following the buffalo, and winter migrations were brutal. He remembered trudging through snow that came up to his knees, his moccasins soaked through, his legs numb. The wind on the open plains was relentless, and there was no escaping it. You simply bent your head and walked hour after hour until someone called a halt. He remembered falling asleep in his mother's arms while she walked, too exhausted to keep his eyes open, and waking later in a new place, the tipi already raised, the fire already burning. The women carried the tipi poles and hides, everything needed to make a home. The men rode ahead on horses, scouting for danger and for game, and the children walked with the women, or rode on travois pulled by dogs or horses. Sometimes the snow was so deep that the horses struggled, their legs breaking through the crust with each step. The travois would catch on drifts, and everyone would have to stop and dig them free, their hands growing numb as they worked. He learned to recognize the signs that a halt was coming, the way the lead riders would slow, the way they would gesture toward a spot sheltered by a hill or a stand of trees. When they stopped, the camp would rise with practiced efficiency, each family knowing exactly what to do. The women would clear snow from the ground where the tipi would stand, using pieces of hide or their hands. The men would drive stakes into the frozen earth, and within an hour the tipis would be up, smoke rising from their peaks, life continuing as if it had never paused. When he was 9, he fell ill. It was winter, of course. Illness always seemed to come in winter, when bodies were weak and resistance low. He remembered lying near the fire, his body burning with fever, his mind drifting in and out of strange, vivid dreams. His mother sat beside him, bathing his forehead with snow, and he could hear voices around him, his father, his grandmother, others he could not name, speaking in low, worried tones. The fever made everything distant and unreal. The walls of the teepees seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, and the fire became a living thing, dancing with purpose. He would drift into sleep and wake moments later, unsure whether hours had passed or only seconds. Time lost its meaning, becoming something fluid and strange, and he floated in it like a leaf on water. His mother prepared medicines, brewing teas from roots and bark that the people had used for generations. The teas were bitter, and he would gag when she held the cup to his lips, but she was patient, making him drink a little at a time. She sang to him too, old songs that her mother had sung to her, songs meant to call back a spirit that was wandering too far from the body. Her voice was steady and strong, and he clung to it like a rope thrown to a drowning man. It was during this illness that he had his first vision, though he did not understand it at the time. He saw himself standing on a vast plain, and around him were horses of every color, white and black and red and yellow, and they were dancing, moving in patterns that seemed both random and purposeful. He saw figures in the distance, tall and indistinct, and they beckoned to him, but he could not reach them. He tried to walk toward them, but the ground beneath his feet kept shifting, and no matter how far he walked, they remained distant. The sky above was filled with clouds that moved too quickly, racing across the heavens as if fleeing from something. The horses continued their dance, and he realized they were not random at all. They were forming shapes, symbols he almost recognized but could not quite name. One of the distant figures raised an arm, pointing toward something behind him, and when he turned, he saw a tree standing alone on the plain. The tree was flowering despite the cold, its branches heavy with blossoms that shimmered like stars. When he woke, he was cold, colder than he had ever been, and his mother was holding him, rocking him gently. He tried to tell her about the vision, but the words would not come, and eventually he fell back into sleep. The illness passed, as illnesses sometimes did, and he grew stronger. But the memory of the vision stayed with him, vivid and strange, and he knew, even then, that it meant something, though he did not know what. His grandmother told him that visions were sacred, that they were messages from the spirits. She said he should remember everything he had seen, every detail, because one day he would understand. He tried to draw what he had seen, scratching images in the dirt with a stick. The horses, the tree, the distant figures. He drew them over and over, trying to capture what he had witnessed in his fever. As he grew older, he learned the skills that winter demanded. He learned to set snares for rabbits and to track deer through snow. He learned to recognize the signs of a coming storm, the way the air grew still, the way the birds fell silent. He learned to build a fire in wind and snow, to coax flames from damp wood, to keep a fire alive through the night. His father taught him to read the snow, to distinguish between the tracks of different animals. A rabbit's tracks were light, barely disturbing the surface, while a deer's were deeper, more defined. He learned that fresh snow could reveal secrets, where animals had passed, where they had paused to feed or rest. Old snow told different stories, the tracks softened and filled with ice, speaking of journeys taken days before. He learned to move quietly through winter landscapes, placing his feet carefully so they would not crunch on crusted snow. Silence was essential when hunting, and he practiced until he could walk so softly that even his father had to look twice to know he was there. He learned, too, that warmth was not something you could take for granted. It was something you earned, something you fought for, something you lost if you grew careless. His fingers froze once when he was learning to handle the bow in winter. He had removed his mittens to feel the string better, and within minutes his fingers had gone white and numb. His father had grabbed his hands and thrust them under his own arms, holding them there until feeling returned in waves of burning pain. The lesson was clear. Winter punished carelessness, and there were no exceptions, no second chances. There was a winter when he was 12, and the hunting was poor. The buffalo had moved south beyond the reach of his band, and the smaller game, the deer and elk, were scarce. He went out with his father and other men, tracking through deep snow, and they found nothing. They stayed out for days, sleeping in the open, wrapped in their robes, and the cold was so intense that he thought he would not survive. They built no fires at night, afraid the smoke would alert any game to their presence. They huddled together, sharing body heat, and he learned what it meant to be truly cold, cold beyond anything he had experienced within the relative safety of the tipi. The men spoke little during those days, conserving their energy. But on the third night, one of the older hunters began to sing, very softly, a prayer song asking the spirits for guidance. But he did survive, and when they finally returned to camp, empty-handed and exhausted, he felt a strange pride. He had endured, and endurance was what mattered. That winter, the elders rationed the food carefully, making sure the children ate first, and then the hunters, and only then the others. He watched his grandmother refuse her share, insisting she was not hungry, and he understood that she was sacrificing herself so that others might live. The camp grew gaunt as winter wore on. The horses became thin, their ribs visible beneath their winter coats, and the people moved with the slow deliberation of those who have no energy to spare. Children stopped playing the games they normally played in winter, their laughter gone. They sat close to the fires, wrapped in whatever robes could be spared, their eyes large and solemn. His mother's face became drawn, the skin tight across her cheekbones. She continued to work, scraping hides and sewing moccasins, but her movements were slower, more careful. She died that spring, not from starvation, but from the accumulated toll of too many winters, too many nights of cold. He mourned her, but he also understood that this was the way of things. Elders gave what they had left, and the young inherited their strength. His grandmother's death marked him in ways he did not fully understand until later. She had been the keeper of stories, the voice that made winter bearable, and without her the cold seemed deeper, more personal. They mourned for her in the traditional way, cutting their hair and gashing their arms. The pain was sharp and immediate, a counterpoint to the dull ache of grief. Her body was placed on a scaffold like the others who had died before her, and he stood, looking up at it, trying to find words to say goodbye. But words seemed inadequate, and in the end he simply stood in silence, letting the cold wind carry his thoughts to wherever she had gone. When he was older, still a boy but beginning to move toward manhood, he began to accompany the men on hunts. Winter hunts were different from summer hunts, more difficult, more dangerous, but also more necessary. He remembered one hunt in particular, a hunt for buffalo that had been spotted near a frozen river. The men moved carefully, silently, and he followed, his breath visible in the cold air. They found the buffalo bedded down in a shallow depression, sheltered from the wind. The hunt was quick and successful, and afterward they butchered the animal where it lay, their hands slick with blood and fat. He remembered the warmth of the buffalo's body, the steam rising from its exposed organs, and he remembered pressing his cold hands against the warm hide, feeling the heat seep into his frozen fingers. It was a small thing, but it stayed with him, the way a living body, even in death, could offer warmth. The buffalo's blood steamed as it poured onto the snow, melting small pools in the white surface. The men worked quickly, knowing that the cold would freeze the meat if they delayed, making it harder to cut. They saved everything, the hide, the organs, the bones that would be boiled for marrow. Nothing was wasted, because waste in winter meant death. They carried the meat back to camp, and that night there was enough for everyone. The tipi was warm, the fire high, and people sat close together, eating and talking, and for a little while winter seemed less cruel. But winters were long, and one good hunt did not change that. The cold always returned, and the work of staying warm continued. Black Elk grew into a young man, and with that came new responsibilities. He was chosen to train with the medicine men to learn the songs and rituals that helped the people endure. He learned that warmth was not only physical but spiritual, that the songs sung in winter had power, that the prayers offered to the spirits could ease suffering, that the ceremonies held in the depths of cold were a way of asserting life against the darkness. He learned to enter the sweat lodge, a small structure heated with stones, where the heat was so intense it was almost unbearable. The sweat lodge was built low to the ground, covered with hides to trap the heat. Inside it was dark, the only light coming from the glowing stones that were carried in from a fire outside. The medicine man would pour water on the stones, and steam would fill the lodge, so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. The heat would press against him, forcing the air from his lungs, and he would have to breathe slowly, carefully, drawing small sips of the scalding air. The sweat lodge was used even in winter, perhaps especially in winter, because it was a way of purging the cold from the body, of reminding yourself that heat still existed, that you were still alive. He would sit in the sweat lodge with the other men, the steam thick and choking, and he would feel his body open, his pores releasing something he could not name. Songs were sung in the darkness, prayers offered to the spirits. The medicine man would speak of visions he had seen, of messages from the ancestors, and Black Elk would listen, feeling the sweat run down his face and back. Afterward, stepping out into the frigid air, his body would steam, and he would feel clean, renewed, ready to face another night. It was a paradox, using heat to fight cold, but it worked. There was a winter when he was older, already a man, when he participated in a vision quest. It was not the season for such things. Vision quests were traditionally done in summer, but he felt called to it, and he went. He climbed to a high place, a hill exposed to the wind, and he sat there, wrapped only in a light robe, and he prayed. The cold was brutal, cutting through his clothes, his skin, his flesh, until he felt it in his very center. He had fasted before beginning the quest, eating nothing for 2 days, and the hunger made the cold feel sharper, more invasive. His stomach cramped, and his head felt light, but these discomforts were part of the process, ways of stripping away the ordinary world. He stayed there for 3 days and 3 nights, fasting, praying, and the cold became something else, not an enemy, but a presence, a teacher. He saw visions again, clearer this time, and he understood that the cold was stripping away everything unnecessary, leaving only what was essential. On the second night, the stars seemed to grow brighter, closer, until he felt he could reach up and touch them. The wind carried voices, whispers he could almost understand, and he knew the spirits were near. On the third day, he saw the 6 grandfathers, the powers of the 6 directions, and they spoke to him of his destiny, of the work he would do for his people. They showed him things that would come to pass, both terrible and wonderful, and he tried to remember every detail. When he came down from the hill, he was changed. He did not speak of what he had seen, not immediately, but those who knew him could see the difference. His eyes held a distance that had not been there before, as if he was looking at this world and another world at the same time. He moved with a new deliberation, each action weighted with purpose. The medicine men recognized what had happened. and they took him aside to hear his vision in full. He spoke for hours, describing everything he had seen, and they nodded, understanding the significance of what the spirits had shown him. Winter had marked him, had shaped him, and he carried that shaping for the rest of his life. He lived through many winters, saw his people's world change in ways he could not have imagined, saw the buffalo disappear and the old ways falter. The white men came, building their forts and roads, bringing diseases that killed more surely than any winter. The buffalo were slaughtered by the thousands, left to rot on the plains, and the Lakota way of life began to collapse. He fought at the greasy grass, the battle the white men called Little Bighorn, and he saw Custer fall. But that victory was brief, hollow, because the tide of change could not be stopped by a single battle. The bands were forced onto reservations, forbidden to hunt, forbidden to practice their ceremonies. The children were taken to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own language, where they were taught that everything about their culture was wrong. He watched his people struggle to survive in this new world, a world where winter was no longer the greatest enemy. The cold still came each year, but now it came to people who were already broken, already defeated. But through it all, he remembered the lessons of those early winters, the value of endurance, the necessity of community, the knowledge that warmth, like life itself, was something fragile and precious. When he was old and his own body began to fail, he thought often of those winter nights in the teepee, the fire burning low, his family close around him. He thought of his grandmother's stories, of his father's silent vigilance, of his mother's hands adjusting the hides to keep out the wind. He thought of the cold, and he was no longer afraid of it. He had seen so much, lived through so much, that death held no terror for him. It was simply another journey, another migration to a new place, and he would make it as he had made all the others, with patience, with acceptance, with the knowledge that he had endured. He thought of the vision he had seen as a child, the horses dancing on the plain, and he understood now what it had meant. The horses were the people themselves, moving through time, struggling to maintain their patterns in a world that wanted to scatter them. He thought of the flowering tree he had seen, blooming despite the cold, and he understood that it represented hope, the stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. He had tried to be that tree for his people, to keep something alive when so much was dying. In his final years, he traveled to perform the ceremonies one last time, to teach what he knew to those who would listen. The government tried to stop him, but he went anyway because some things were more important than laws made by strangers. He stood in the center of the circle, feeling the winter wind on his face, and he sang the old songs. His voice was weaker than it had been, but the words were the same, the prayers unchanged by time. Young people came to hear him, hungry for connection to their past, and he told them everything he could remember. He told them about the buffalo days, about the hunts and the migrations, about the ceremonies that had sustained the people. He told them about winter, about the cold that tested and taught, about the fire that had to be maintained through the darkest nights. He told them that endurance was possible, that survival was a form of resistance, that remembering was a way of keeping alive what others wanted to destroy. He had lived with it all his life, and when his time came, he knew he would meet it again, one final time, and that it would be, in its own way, a homecoming. The cold would take him as it had taken so many others, but he would not go into it unprepared. He had learned its lessons, had made peace with its harshness, had found in its depths a kind of clarity that warmth could never provide. Winter had been his first teacher and would be his last, and there was a symmetry in that, a completion. He closed his eyes and saw again the vast plain, the dancing horses, the distant figures beckoning. This time he knew he would reach them, would cross that shifting ground and stand in their presence. This time the journey would not end with waking. This time winter would carry him all the way home to the place where his grandmother waited, where the fire never went out, where the stories continued forever. The cold that had shaped him, that had tested and taught him, would be the door through which he passed into whatever came next. And he was ready, had been ready, since that first winter of his life, when he had drawn his first breath in a smoky tipi and learned that existence was struggle, and struggle was sacred. He died in winter, as he knew he would, and those who found him said his face was peaceful. The snow fell softly that day, covering the earth in white silence, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled once, then was quiet. They wrapped him in robes and placed him on a scaffold, as they had done for his grandmother and so many others. The wind moved through the posts, making them creak, and the sky was grey and low, heavy with coming snow. And in the camp below, in a teepee warmed by fire, a child was born, drawing first breath in the same season that had marked the beginning of Black Elk's life. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, and winter settled over the land once more, patient and eternal and unforgiving. The old men would tell the story of Black Elk, of his visions and his wisdom, and the children would listen, their eyes wide in the firelight. They would learn, as he had learned, that winter was a teacher, that cold was a truth, that survival required more than strength, it required memory, community, and the courage to keep the fire burning through the longest nights. And so his story became part of the great story, the endless tale of a people who had learned to live in a hard land, who had found beauty in severity, warmth in togetherness, meaning in endurance. The cold would come again and again, and the people would meet it, as they always had, with the lessons passed down through generations, with the knowledge that spring always followed winter, that life persisted, that nothing was ever truly lost as long as someone remembered. Black Elk had been that memory, that bridge between past and future, and though his body returned to the earth, his teachings remained, carried forward by those who had listened, who had understood that his words were not just about winter, but about everything, about how to live, how to endure, how to find meaning in the face of hardship, how to keep what mattered most alive when everything else was taken away. The snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering his scaffold, covering the camp, covering the great plains that stretched beyond sight. And beneath that white blanket, life waited, dormant but not dead, ready to return when the season turned, when the cold released its grip, when the earth remembered how to bloom. But that was for later. For now, there was only winter, only the cold, only the wind moving across the frozen land, carrying with it the whispers of all those who had come before, all those who had learned the same lessons, all those who had understood that winter was not the end, but a passage, a test, a teacher whose lessons, once learned, were never forgotten. There is a question that lingers in the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. How did people truly stay warm on the coldest nights, when the temperature dropped far below freezing and the wind cut through everything? We have artifacts, we have structures, we have oral histories, but warmth itself leaves no trace. You cannot excavate warmth from the ground. You cannot carbon date the feeling of a fire's heat on your skin, or catalogue the specific comfort of a well-arranged bed of hides. The archaeologist's trowel uncovers pottery shards, stone tools, the charred remains of ancient hearths, but the sensation of heat, the way it spreads across cold fingers, the way it loosens tight muscles, the way it creates a sphere of safety in an otherwise hostile world, this cannot be preserved in any museum. The past comes to us in fragments, and some of the most essential fragments are made of nothing solid at all. What we have instead are fragments, pieces of a puzzle that suggest an answer without ever quite completing it. We have the tipi, that elegant cone of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles, and we know it was carefully designed. The structure itself speaks of generations of accumulated wisdom, of trial and error refined across centuries into something approaching perfection. Each element of the tipi's construction served multiple purposes, nothing wasted, every choice deliberate. The Lakota and other plains peoples understood aerodynamics in ways they could never have articulated in scientific terms but demonstrated through practice. The smoke hole at the top of the tipi was adjustable, controlled by two wooden poles, and this allowed the inhabitants to regulate the draft. These poles, called smoke flaps or ears, could be shifted according to wind direction, creating a venturi effect that drew smoke upward and out while preventing downdrafts that would fill the interior with choking fumes. The person tending the fire needed to understand wind patterns, to read the sky and anticipate changes in weather, to know by instinct when to adjust the flaps before the smoke became unbearable. Too much air, and the fire burned too hot, consuming wood quickly. Too little, and smoke accumulated, making the space unbreathable. It was a constant calibration, an ongoing dialogue between fire and wind. This was not a structure you could simply erect and forget. It required attention, adjustment, a kind of conversation with the elements that never ceased. Inside the tipi, there was often an inner lining, sometimes called a dew cloth or draft cloth, hung several feet above the ground. This created a dead air space between the outer cover and the inner wall, an insulating layer that trapped warmth and prevented drafts from reaching the people inside. The liner was typically decorated, painted with family symbols and sacred designs, so that even this functional element became an expression of identity and belief. It hung from the lodge poles and extended down to where it was staked to the ground, creating a sealed envelope of warmer air that surrounded the living space. The cold air that entered through the bottom of the tipi would sink and be drawn toward the fire, creating a convection current that pulled fresh air in while pushing smoke up and out. It was ingenious, and it worked, though it was never perfect. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the temperature plummeted to 40 below, even the best designed tipi could not completely exclude the cold. Frost would form on the inner walls, creating intricate patterns of ice crystals that caught the firelight. We know that people slept on raised beds of willow branches or wooden platforms covered with layers of hides and furs. Sleeping directly on the ground meant losing heat to the earth, which in winter was frozen solid and acted as a massive heat sink. The platform bed, whether made of flexible willow wands lashed together or of more substantial wooden frames, created a separation between the sleeper and that endless cold reservoir below. Even a gap of just a few inches made an enormous difference in comfort and survival. By elevating the sleeping surface, even by a few inches, they created an air gap that provided some insulation. The bedding itself was layered, buffalo robes, deer hides, bear skins, each layer trapping air, which is a better insulator than any solid material. The buffalo robe was particularly prized, its long fur dense and crimped in a way that created countless tiny air pockets. A well-prepared robe, with the fur left at full length and the hide properly tanned, could weigh 20 pounds and provide warmth equivalent to several modern blankets. But here is where the mystery deepens. Even with all these measures, the cold was still there. The fire in the center of the tipi provided warmth, but it was a small fire, carefully managed, and its heat radiated outward in a sphere, warming those close to it, but leaving those farther away cold. The physics of radiant heat meant that someone sitting 3 feet from the fire might be comfortable, while someone 6 feet away shivered. The fire could not be made larger without consuming too much wood, without creating dangerous conditions, without filling the space with more smoke than the ventilation could handle. So how did people manage the long, frozen nights? Part of the answer lies in human physiology and behavior. The body itself is a furnace, burning calories to maintain its core temperature at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But this furnace requires fuel, and in winter, when physical activity was limited and food supplies had to be carefully rationed, the body's ability to generate heat was always in question. People slept close together, sharing body heat. A tipi that might have been spacious in summer became crowded in winter, with family members pressed side by side, their combined warmth greater than the sum of its parts. This was not merely practical, it was social, familial, a physical expression of solidarity against the cold. Grandparents, parents, children, sometimes extended family or close friends, all arranged themselves in the warmest configuration, the young and old, who lost heat more quickly, placed in the center. They wore their clothes to bed, layers of hide and fur that served as both clothing and blankets. They wrapped themselves in heavy robes, and they learned to sleep in positions that conserved heat, curled tightly, limbs drawn in, minimizing surface area. The fetal position is natural to cold sleepers, a way of protecting the vital organs and reducing exposure. Arms tucked in, knees drawn up, head partially covered. Every adjustment reduced the body's heat loss by small but significant margins. They also adapted their metabolism. People who live in cold climates develop physiological changes over time, better circulation to the extremities, a higher basal metabolic rate, more efficient fat storage. These adaptations occur both over generations through natural selection and within individual lifetimes as the body acclimates to its environment. Inuit peoples, for example, have been shown to have a higher metabolic rate than populations from temperate zones, burning more calories at rest to maintain body temperature. The diet of plains peoples in winter was rich in fat, which provided both calories and insulation. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries, was a winter staple, dense, calorie-rich, designed to fuel the internal furnace that kept the body warm. A pound of pemmican contained roughly 3,000 calories, nearly all of them from fat and protein. It did not freeze solid, could be eaten without preparation, and would sustain a person through a day of winter travel when no other food was available. But there were other technologies, subtler and harder to trace. Snow, paradoxically, was used as insulation. The Inuit had long known that snow, properly used, was not an enemy, but an ally. Its crystalline structure trapped air in a way that few other materials could match, creating an insulating barrier that could turn a howling wasteland into something almost survivable. Heaped around the base of a teepee, snow created a barrier against wind and trapped air, much like the snow that insulates an igloo. Some accounts describe winter camps where teepees were partially dug into the earth, creating pit houses that took advantage of the ground's thermal mass. These semi-subterranean structures, found in archaeological sites across the northern plains, show evidence of careful engineering. The floor would be excavated to a depth of 2 or 3 feet, and the tipi erected over this depression, its lower edge secured at the original ground level. The earth, even when frozen on top, retains some warmth deeper down, and by lowering the floor of a dwelling, people could access that residual heat. We find evidence of this in archaeological sites, circular depressions, post holes, fire-cracked rocks, but we cannot reconstruct the exact techniques used. The work involved in creating such a shelter was considerable. The ground had to be excavated before it froze solid, or if that was impossible, fires had to be built to thaw the earth, then the soil removed, then the process repeated. There were also the sweat lodges mentioned earlier, and these are particularly mysterious. A sweat lodge is a small, domed structure, often built from bent willow branches and covered with hides. The willow frame was typically 6 to 8 feet in diameter, low to the ground, designed to hold in heat and steam with maximum efficiency. The entrance faced east toward the rising sun, though the reasons for this orientation were as much spiritual as practical. Stones are heated in a fire until they glow, then brought inside the lodge and placed in a central pit. Water is poured over the stones, creating steam, and the temperature inside the lodge rises dramatically. The stones, called grandfather stones in some traditions, had to be selected carefully. River stones that would not explode when heated, dense enough to hold heat for extended periods. They would be heated for hours in a sacred fire until they glowed orange-red in the darkness. The sweat lodge was used for purification, for healing, for ceremony, but it was also, in winter, a way to experience intense heat, to remind the body what warmth felt like. After a sweat, people would emerge into the cold, and though it seems counterintuitive, the contrast was invigorating, and the body's core temperature remained elevated for hours afterward. This alternation between extreme heat and cold has profound effects on the circulatory system, causing blood vessels to dilate and then contract, improving overall circulation and possibly triggering the release of endorphins. The shock of cold air on superheated skin is intense, almost painful, but it leaves a sensation of aliveness, of vitality. This practice suggests a sophisticated understanding of thermoregulation, of how the body responds to extremes of heat and cold. But we do not know all the rituals, all the songs, all the prayers that accompanied these practices. The sweat lodge was, and remains, a sacred space, and much of what occurred inside was private, not recorded, not shared with outsiders. We have accounts from anthropologists, from travelers, from missionaries, but these are outsider perspectives, incomplete by definition. We know they existed because they are mentioned in oral histories, but their specific forms are lost. Were there songs that calmed the mind, that made the cold more bearable by altering perception? The relationship between mental state and physical sensation is well documented. Pain can be reduced through meditation, through focused breathing, through altered states of consciousness that change how the nervous system processes signals. We know that meditation and mental focus can change how the body experiences temperature. Monks in Tibet practice tummo, a form of meditation that allows them to generate body heat, to sit in snow without freezing. Could similar practices have existed among native peoples, unrecorded because they were sacred, private, not for outsiders? The tummo practitioners of Tibet can raise their core body temperature through visualization and breathing techniques, imagining inner fires that somehow translate into actual metabolic heat production. If such techniques existed among plains peoples, they would have been closely guarded, taught only to initiates, and possibly lost when populations were decimated by disease and warfare. There is also the question of fire itself. Fire was not just a heat source, it was a living entity, a spirit that required care and respect. In many native traditions, fire was among the oldest of spirits, the first gift, the thing that separated humans from animals. It was female in some traditions, male in others, but always possessed of will and personality. People spoke to the fire, thanked it, fed it with offerings. Was this merely symbolic, or did it serve a deeper purpose, a way of maintaining focus, of ensuring that someone was always attending to the fire, always watching? The practical effect of treating fire as sacred was that it received constant attention. In a world where letting the fire die could mean death, religious observation and survival necessity were perfectly aligned. We find fire pits in archaeological sites ringed with stones, filled with charcoal and ash. We find tools for making fire, flint, pyrite, fire drills, and we know that people carried fire with them when they moved, preserved in smoldering punk wood or slow-burning fungus. The fire drill required skill and patience, the right combination of wood types, a hard spindle rotated rapidly against a softer board, the friction creating fine dust that would eventually smolder and ignite. In wet or cold conditions, starting fire this way could take half an hour or more. Fire was precious, and letting it go out was a failure, a danger. But beyond the mechanics, there is something we cannot measure, the psychological comfort of fire, the way it creates a center, a focal point, a sense of safety in the darkness. Human beings are diurnal creatures ill-equipped for darkness, and fire extends the day, creates a space where darkness is held at bay. The circle of firelight becomes the boundary of the known world, and beyond it lies everything else. Firelight flickers, and in its flickering the darkness is held at bay. This is not quantifiable, but it is real. The dancing shadows, the play of light across familiar faces, the way fire transforms a hide wall into a moving canvas of amber and gold, these things matter. They create the conditions for storytelling, for human connection, for the transmission of knowledge and culture. Then there are the mysteries we will never solve. We know that some winter camps were located in specific places, river valleys, sheltered coulees, areas with natural windbreaks. These locations were returned to year after year, generation after generation. We find layers of occupation in the archaeological record, evidence of repeated use spanning centuries, suggesting that certain places were known to be superior for winter survival. But how did people choose these places? Was it trial and error accumulated over generations? Or was there knowledge of microclimates, of subtle differences in temperature and wind patterns? The difference between a good winter camp and a deadly one might be just a few degrees of temperature, a slight reduction in wind speed, better access to water that hadn't frozen solid. The knowledge of where these places existed would have been vital, passed down as carefully as any other survival skill. We know that animals were observed closely, where they bedded down, which slopes they favored. Buffalo in winter would dig through snow to reach grass, and they chose places where the snow was shallower, where the wind had blown it away. The wind-swept ridges where buffalo poured through shallow snow to reach dried grass were also places where a camp might be established with less snow to contend with, less chance of being buried by drifts. Animals were teachers, and watching them was a form of education. Did people learn from this, follow the buffalo not just for meat, but for knowledge of the landscape? We find petroglyphs and pictographs in caves and rock shelters, and some of these sites show evidence of winter occupation. The presence of rock art in places that were clearly inhabited during cold months raises questions about priorities and motivations. Why spend time and energy creating images when survival was precarious? The images of animals, of spirits, of abstract patterns were made by people sitting in the cold, chipping away at stone, painting with mineral pigments. Why? The pigments themselves, ochre, charcoal, white clay, had to be gathered, prepared, sometimes mixed with fat or plant extracts to create the right consistency. The work was painstaking, done in poor light, with cold fingers, on rough stone surfaces. Was it ritual, storytelling, record-keeping, or something else entirely? The images remain, but their meaning is obscured by time. Some images seem to depict hunts, others ceremonies, still others geometric patterns that might represent clan symbols, star maps, territorial markers, or pure aesthetic expression. We project our interpretations onto them, but we cannot know with certainty what the makers intended. We can speculate, interpret, but we cannot know with certainty. There is also the enigma of clothing. The garments worn by plains peoples were works of extraordinary craftsmanship, each one representing hundreds of hours of skilled labor. A single winter robe might take weeks to prepare, from the initial hunting of the animal to the final decoration. We have fragments of hide clothing preserved in dry caves or frozen ground, and we can see the stitching, the cut, the layering, but we cannot know how it felt to wear these clothes day after day, how they moved with the body, how they stiffened in cold and softened near fire. The leather, when frozen, became rigid, almost armor-like, and had to be carefully warmed and worked before it would bend. But near fire, the same material became supple, almost liquid, conforming to the body's shape. We know that hides were brain-tanned, a process that made them soft and supple, but we do not know all the steps, all the techniques that have been lost. We know that sinew was used for thread, that bone needles and awls were used for sewing, that quillwork and beadwork decorated the clothing, but we do not know how long it took to make a single garment, how many hours of work went into preparing a winter robe. The brain tanning process was laborious and time-consuming. The hide had to be cleaned, scraped free of meat and fat, then treated with a paste made from the animal's own brain, which contains natural oils and enzymes that break down the proteins in the hide. We find tools in the ground, scrapers, knives, awls, and we can guess at their use, but the hands that held them, the knowledge that guided them, are gone. There is a kind of loneliness in this, a sense of reaching towards something that remains just out of grasp. The gap between holding a tool and understanding its use fully is vast. We can replicate the motions, but we cannot replicate the accumulated instinct, the thousands of small adjustments that come from a lifetime of practice. We stand in the present, looking back, and we see shadows, echoes, hints of a life lived in ways we can barely imagine. And yet in those hints there is something profound. The archaeological record gives us objects, but it cannot give us experience. We know what happened, but not always what it meant, what it felt like, how it shaped the people who lived through it. The people who endured those winters were not so different from us. They loved, they feared, they hoped, they grieved. They told jokes, fell in love, argued with family members, worried about their children, dreamed of better times. The cold did not make them less human. If anything, it may have intensified their humanity, made every moment of warmth and connection more precious. They felt the cold, and they fought against it, and they found ways to survive. That survival was not guaranteed. Many did not make it through winter, but enough did, generation after generation, to carry the knowledge forward. The winter camps of the northern plains sometimes saw death rates as high as 10 to 15% during particularly harsh seasons. Children and the elderly were most vulnerable, but even healthy adults could succumb to accidents, to sudden cold snaps, to the accumulation of small stresses that eventually overwhelmed the body's defenses. And some of that knowledge persists not in books or museums, but in the memories of descendants, in the stories still told, in the practices still performed. The mystery, then, is not complete. There are still people who know how to set up a tipi properly, who remember the songs that go with certain ceremonies, who can brain tan a hide or make pemmican according to traditional methods. This knowledge exists in a precarious state, neither fully preserved nor fully lost. It is partial, fragmented, but it is there, waiting to be pieced together, waiting for us to listen, to imagine, to honor the ingenuity and resilience of those who came before. The act of remembering itself becomes a form of survival, a way of ensuring that the knowledge and experience of past generations continues to inform the present. When we ask how people stayed warm on the coldest nights, we are really asking something larger. How did they maintain their humanity in circumstances that seem to us almost unimaginable? The answer, incomplete as it must be, lies in the details we can reconstruct and in the spaces between those details where imagination and respect must fill the gaps. We know about the tipi's engineering, the layered bedding, the careful management of fire, but we must imagine the lived experience, the way a child might wake in the night, frightened by the wind, and be comforted by a parent's warmth, by whispered reassurance. We must imagine the skill required to keep a family alive through months of darkness and cold, the constant vigilance, the accumulated wisdom that meant the difference between survival and death. This was not a passive existence, not simply enduring until spring, but an active engagement with the environment, a continuous application of knowledge and technique. The winter camp was a demonstration of human ingenuity at its most essential. Every aspect of life had to be considered, planned for, executed with precision because mistakes were often fatal. There were protocols for nearly everything, for setting up camp, for organizing the interior of the tipi, for managing food supplies, for treating frostbite and hypothermia. These protocols were taught from childhood, passed down through demonstration and practice, becoming instinctual. We can study the material culture, analyze the tools and structures, but we cannot fully grasp the mental landscape, the worldview that made these technologies not just possible, but elegant. The understanding that a buffalo's thick winter coat grew in a pattern that shed water and snow, and that this pattern should be considered when fashioning a robe. The knowledge that certain plants, when burned, produced a smoke that helped preserve meat and repel insects. The awareness that the angle of the winter sun, though weak, could be used to advantage, that a tipi positioned to catch the southern exposure would be warmer than one that faced north. These were not written down in manuals or textbooks. They were embedded in practice, in the way things were done, in the corrections offered by elders when younger people made mistakes, in the accumulated observation of generations who lived intimately with their environment. The relationship between people and landscape was not one of domination but of negotiation, of constant learning. The land was teacher, provider, sometimes adversary, but always present, always shaping the conditions of existence. And within this relationship, warmth was not just a physical state, but a social and spiritual one as well. The warmth of the fire was also the warmth of family gathered around it, of stories told and retold, of songs sung, of the sense of belonging to a community that would care for you when you could not care for yourself. The elderly person who could no longer hunt or gather was still valued, still fed, still given a place near the fire because they carried knowledge, memory, the stories that connected present to past. This social warmth, this network of care and obligation, was as essential to survival as any physical technology. We find evidence of this care in the archaeological record, burials that show individuals with severe disabilities who nevertheless lived to adulthood, who must have been supported by their communities for years. The survival of the vulnerable is perhaps the clearest measure of a society's sophistication, its moral development. The question of how people stayed warm, then, expands beyond the merely physical into the realm of culture, of social organization, of the values that determine who lives and who dies. Warmth is about heat, yes, but it is also about inclusion, about the decision to share resources even when those resources are scarce. On the coldest nights, when the fire burned low and the wind screamed and the darkness seemed absolute, what kept people alive was not just the hide walls and the fur robes, but the certainty that they were not alone, that others were enduring the same conditions, that morning would come, that spring would return. This psychological resilience, this ability to endure hardship without losing hope, is as remarkable as any material technology. It required a certain mental toughness, yes, but also a deep trust in the rhythms of nature, a confidence born of experience that winter, however terrible, was temporary. The stories told around winter fires often emphasized endurance, patience, the eventual triumph of persistence over adversity. These were not just entertainment, but education, preparation, a way of training the mind to accept hardship as natural and survivable. And there were moments, surely, of transcendent beauty. The way the sun, low on the winter horizon, would illuminate ice crystals in the air, creating halos and sundogs and pillars of light. The absolute silence of a cold, still night, when even sound seemed frozen. The northern lights, shimmering curtains of green and red across the darkness, mysterious and sacred, interpreted as spirits dancing, as messages from the ancestors, as signs of things to come. These moments of beauty in the midst of hardship must have mattered, must have made the struggle worthwhile. The human capacity to find meaning and beauty, even in difficult circumstances, is perhaps our greatest survival trait. It allows us to endure, to persist, to find reasons to continue when purely rational calculation, might suggest surrender. The people of the winter camps knew this, whether consciously or not. They created beauty in their clothing, in their tools, in their ceremonies, not as luxury, but as necessity, as a way of affirming that life was worth living, that there was more to existence than mere survival. The decorated tipi liner, the intricate quill work on a pair of moccasins, the carved designs on a fire drill, these things took time and energy that might have been spent on more obviously practical tasks. But they were not frivolous, they were essential to maintaining morale, identity, a sense of self-worth. And perhaps this is the deepest mystery of all, not how people survived physically, but how they maintained their humanity, their culture, their sense of purpose and meaning in circumstances that tested every limit. The answer lies partly in the technologies we can reconstruct, the tipi, the clothing, the fire management, but more fundamentally in the intangible qualities that those technologies expressed. The care taken in preparing a buffalo robe, making it soft and warm and beautiful, spoke to a relationship with the animal, a gratitude for its sacrifice, a recognition that the robe was not just insulation, but a gift. The attention paid to the fire, treating it as sacred, ensured that it received the care it needed to keep burning. The arrangement of sleeping places in the tipi, with the most vulnerable in the warmest spots, reflected a social ethic that valued the collective over the individual, that understood survival as a communal project. These attitudes, these ways of being in the world, cannot be excavated from the ground, but they are as real and as essential as any artifact. We live now in a world where warmth comes at the flip of a switch, where we are insulated from the elements in ways that would have seemed miraculous to the people of the winter camps. We have forgotten, most of us, what it means to be truly cold, to have our survival depend on our own knowledge and skill and the cooperation of those around us. But in forgetting, we have lost something as well. We have lost the intimate knowledge of fire, the understanding of wind and weather, the sense of being embedded in a landscape rather than separate from it. We have lost, perhaps, some measure of resilience, of the confidence that comes from knowing we can endure hardship because our ancestors did. The mystery of how people stayed warm on the coldest nights is ultimately a mystery of human capacity, of adaptation and ingenuity and social solidarity. It reminds us that we are capable of far more than we usually imagine, that the human animal, for all its apparent fragility, is remarkably tough when necessity demands. The knowledge encoded in the design of a tipi, in the technique of brain tanning, in the recipe for pemmican, represents thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, of experiments tried and refined, of successful strategies passed down and unsuccessful ones forgotten. This knowledge was not static, but constantly evolving, adapting to new circumstances, incorporating new insights. And it is not entirely lost. There are still people who carry this knowledge, who practice these techniques, who maintain the connection to ancestral ways of living. They are fewer than they once were, and the knowledge is more fragmented, but it persists. In this persistence there is hope, a suggestion that we have not entirely severed the connection to our past, that the wisdom of those who endured the coldest nights still has something to teach us. We may never know exactly what it felt like to sleep in a winter teepee, to wake with frost on our faces, to tend a fire through a sub-zero night. But we can honor the people who did these things, who survived against odds that seem impossible, who maintained their culture and their humanity through circumstances we can barely imagine. We can study what remains, listen to what is still told, and imagine the rest with humility and respect. The warmth that sustained them was physical, yes, but it was also social, spiritual, cultural. It was the warmth of human connection, of knowledge shared, of beauty created in the face of hardship. It was the warmth of resilience, of the refusal to surrender to the cold, of the determination to see another spring. And in the end, this is what we must remember, that the people of the winter camps did see another spring year after year, generation after generation. They survived, and in surviving, they ensured that we would exist, that we would inherit their world and their wisdom, however, incompletely. The mystery remains, partial and fragmented, but it is there, waiting to be pieced together, waiting for us to listen, to imagine, to honor the ingenuity and resilience of those who came before. In honoring them, we connect ourselves to a long chain of human endurance, of knowledge accumulated and shared, of the stubborn determination to survive and flourish even when the cold seems absolute. This connection across time, this recognition of shared humanity with people whose lives were so different from our own, is itself a kind of warmth. It reminds us that we are not alone, that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves, that the struggles and triumphs of the past echo forward into the present. The fire that burned in the center of a winter teepee 200 years ago is gone, its heat dissipated into the frozen air, but the knowledge of how to build and tend that fire remains, encoded in artifacts and memories and the practices of descendants. This knowledge is a kind of warmth that transcends time, a gift from those who came before to those who will come after. And so we stand in the present, looking back at those winter camps, at those people gathered around fires, and we ask our question, how did they stay warm? The answer, incomplete and fragmentary as it must be, is that they stayed warm through knowledge, through community, through the determination to endure, and through the understanding that warmth is not just physical, but profoundly human, a quality of connection, of care, of the refusal to let the cold extinguish the light. Winter revealed truths that other seasons concealed, and one of those truths was that not all people faced the cold equally. The snow fell on everyone, the wind cut through every camp, but the experience of enduring these forces was not uniform. It never had been, and perhaps it never could be. In societies that prided themselves on generosity and communal sharing, there were still differences, subtle, often unspoken, but real nonetheless. These differences shaped who slept soundly and who shivered through the night, who ate well and who went hungry, who survived with dignity intact and who barely survived at all. A chief did not freeze while others survived. A medicine person did not go without while the rest of the band struggled. But there were differences in degree, in access, in the small comforts that made survival more bearable, the extra buffalo robe, the sheltered sleeping spot, the assurance that tomorrow's meal would come. The Lakota, like many plains peoples, had a social structure that was relatively egalitarian compared to the rigid hierarchies of European societies. There was no king draped in ermine and jewels, no landed nobility extracting tribute from peasants, no system of hereditary wealth passing untouched from generation to generation. Leadership was earned through skill, bravery, wisdom, and generosity, and it could be lost if a leader failed to serve the people. A man who led courageously in summer could find himself without followers by winter if his judgment proved poor or his heart grew selfish. But this does not mean everyone was equal, especially in winter. The season had a way of magnifying every social distinction, making visible what summer's abundance had softened or obscured. A chief, a man chosen to lead a band or tribe, had responsibilities that set him apart. He was expected to provide for his people, to make decisions about when to move camp, where to hunt, how to distribute resources when game was scarce and bellies were empty. And because of these responsibilities, he was often given certain privileges. His teepee might be larger, its buffalo hide walls doubled for insulation, positioned in a place that was more sheltered from the wind, perhaps in a grove of cottonwoods or against a protective bluff. He might receive the choicest cuts of meat after a hunt, or the thickest buffalo robes with fur so dense that frost formed on its outer surface, while warmth radiated within. The women of his family might have access to more sinew for sewing, more porcupine quills for decoration, more tools to make the work of survival slightly less exhausting. This was not greed, it was pragmatic. A leader needed to be strong, visible, capable of making clear decisions in moments of crisis, and that required being well-fed, well-rested, better able to withstand the cold that dulled the mind and weakened the body. But this privilege was conditional, earned through service, and it came with expectations that were absolute and unforgiving. A chief who hoarded resources, who kept warm while his people froze, who ate well while children went hungry, would not remain a chief for long. Generosity was the currency of leadership, and a chief was expected to give away more than he kept to ensure that widows and orphans were cared for, that the elderly had enough to eat, that hunters had the tools they needed. His tipi might be the largest in camp, but it was also the one that strangers entered seeking help, where councils were held deep into the night, where the burdens of an entire community were carried on one man's shoulders. So his privilege was real, but it was also a burden. The weight of responsibility measured in the faces of those who depended on him. His warmer tipi, his better robes, these were not luxuries, but tools that allowed him to serve, to remain strong enough to lead when leadership was most desperately needed. On winter nights, when the temperature plummeted and the wind howled like something alive and angry, the chief was expected to remain awake, to tend his fire, to be ready if crisis struck the camp. He was expected to be the first to volunteer for dangerous winter hunts, to risk his life tracking buffalo through blizzards, to demonstrate the courage he asked of others. Medicine people occupied a different kind of privileged space. They were the keepers of sacred knowledge, the ones who communed with spirits, who understood the invisible forces that shaped the world and mediated between the seen and unseen realms. In winter, when illness spread through close-quartered teepees and people weakened from inadequate food and relentless cold, the medicine person's role became critical. They performed healing ceremonies that lasted through the night, sang songs that called on spiritual power to drive away sickness, prepared remedies from roots and herbs that had been carefully gathered and dried during warmer months. And because their work was sacred, they were often given protection from the worst hardships. A medicine person might receive special furs. White buffalo robes were particularly prized, not for vanity, but because these items carried spiritual significance, were believed to enhance the medicine person's power and their connection to the sacred. Their tipi might contain objects wrapped carefully against the cold, bundles containing sacred items, herbs that needed to be preserved at specific temperatures, objects used in ceremony that could not be allowed to freeze or become damaged. Sweetgrass braids hung from the lodge poles, sage bundles rested in parfleche containers, and painted shields wrapped in soft leather occupied places of honor. The medicine person's warmth, then, was not just personal comfort, but a form of spiritual protection. If the sacred objects froze, if the medicine person fell ill and could not perform the ceremonies that connected the people to the spirit world, the entire community suffered because the link to forces greater than themselves was weakened or severed. So the community ensured the medicine person's survival, gave them what they needed, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding that some roles were too important to risk. When a successful hunt brought meat to camp, portions were carried to the medicine person's lodge before the general distribution began. When women tanned new hides, the softest and most supple, were often offered to the medicine person because their work required them to sit for long hours in ceremony, and comfort allowed for greater spiritual concentration. When firewood was gathered, extra loads were stacked near the medicine tipi because the sacred bundles required constant warmth, and the ceremonies often burned through the night. Skilled hunters, too, occupied a privileged position, though their privilege was perhaps the most openly earned and least controversial. A hunter who could bring down buffalo in the depths of winter who could track elk through deep snow that reached above the knee, who returned again and again with meat when others came back empty-handed. That hunter was valuable beyond measure, and so hunters were given priority in certain ways. After a successful hunt, they received fresh hides, still warm from the animal's body and steaming in the frozen air, and these hides could be fashioned into clothing, robes, moccasins that kept feet dry in the snow. The warmth of fresh kill was immediate and precious, and a hunter who provided it earned not just gratitude, but practical benefits. He might be given the liver, the tongue, the richest organ meats which provided quick energy and dense nutrition, the kind of sustenance that built strength and endurance for the next hunt. His family would eat better, dress warmer, and this in turn allowed him to hunt more effectively, creating a cycle of success. His children wore moccasins that didn't leak. His wife had enough sinew to repair tears in their lodge. His elderly parents received portions of fresh meat that kept them strong through the coldest months. But this privilege too came with expectations. A great hunter was expected to share his kill, to provide for those who could not hunt, the widows whose husbands had died, the elderly whose hands shook too badly to draw a bow, the injured recovering from accidents or warfare. Hoarding meat was unthinkable, a violation of the fundamental social contract that held the community together. A hunter might keep enough for his immediate family's needs, but the rest was distributed according to custom, portions to elders, to the chief, to families in need, to anyone who asked, with genuine hunger in their eyes. So even the hunter's privilege was communal, folded back into the welfare of the group. His skill elevated him, but it also bound him to obligations that sometimes felt heavier than the game he carried on his shoulders through miles of deep snow. There were also those who held sacred objects, the keepers of pipes and bundles, whose role was to maintain the spiritual center of the community. These individuals were often given special consideration in winter because their bundles required care that went beyond ordinary attention. Sacred pipes could not be allowed to freeze. Certain herbs and objects needed specific temperatures and conditions. The keeper of a sacred bundle might have a slightly warmer space in the tipi, might receive extra firewood to ensure the bundle was protected, might be excused from certain communal labors so they could devote themselves to their spiritual responsibilities. This was not personal comfort. It was the preservation of something larger than any individual. The bundles contained the accumulated spiritual power of generations, objects that had been blessed by visions, items that carried the prayers of ancestors who had long since walked into the spirit world. And yet, despite these differences, winter had a way of leveling everything. The cold did not care about status, did not recognize privilege, did not pause at the entrance of a chief's tipi or show mercy to a medicine person's aged hands. A chief could freeze as easily as a commoner if the fire went out. A medicine person could starve if the hunt failed and the stored food ran dry. A great hunter could die of exposure if caught in a sudden storm, his skills useless against wind that stole breath and cold that numbed fingers until he could no longer hold his weapons. Winter respected nothing but itself, its own power, its own timeline, its own indifferent cruelty. This knowledge shaped behavior, created a kind of humility. The chief might have a warmer teepee, but he still spent nights awake, worrying about his people, calculating how many days the stored food would last, wondering if the buffalo would return before starvation set in. The medicine person might have sacred robes, but they still felt the bite of the wind when they stepped outside to gather snow for water, still knew the gnawing anxiety that came when their remedies failed and a child died, despite all prayers and ceremonies. The hunter might eat better, but he still risked his life every time he went out into the snow, still knew that one misstep, One moment of carelessness could mean he would never return to the warmth of his lodge. There were also customs and rituals that reinforced communal bonds in winter, that reminded everyone of their interdependence. The winter count, a pictorial history kept by many plains tribes, was often reviewed and discussed during long winter nights when the cold made outdoor activity impossible and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Elders would point to the symbols painted on buffalo hide, explaining what each represented: a great hunt, when the buffalo were so numerous they blackened the plains; a battle with enemies that left both sides diminished; a winter of starvation when people ate their horses and then their leather clothing; a year of abundance when every child was fat and laughing. These recitations were not just history lessons. They were reminders that the community had survived before, that hardship was temporary, that spring would come again, as it always had. The telling of these stories was a kind of shared warmth, a way of strengthening bonds when physical survival felt precarious. Young people listened and learned their place in a continuity that stretched back beyond memory, understanding that they were part of something larger than their individual suffering. There were also gift-giving ceremonies, where those who had more gave to those who had less. A successful hunter might give away an entire buffalo robe, or several pairs of moccasins lined with rabbit fur, or a share of dried meat that represented weeks of his labor. These gifts were not charity in the way Europeans would understand the term. They were investments in the social fabric, acknowledgements that today's giver might be tomorrow's receiver. Winter made this reciprocity visible, essential, impossible to ignore or deny. You gave because you knew that someday you might need to receive, and the community's survival depended on this continuous circulation of resources. A man who gave generously in winter when his hunts were successful earned a form of social insurance, the knowledge that if his fortune changed, if he was injured or his skills failed, others would remember and provide for him in turn. Women, too, occupied specific roles that shaped their experience of winter. The work of preparing hides, sewing clothing, maintaining the tipi, cooking, caring for children, all of this was women's work, and it was essential to survival in ways that were sometimes overlooked because the work was constant and unglamorous. A woman skilled at tanning hides, at making moccasins that did not leak or wear through after a few days of walking in snow, at sewing garments that fit well and held warmth without restricting movement. Such a woman increased her family's chances of survival. And in some cases, particularly skilled women gained status, were recognized and valued for their abilities, were sought out by others who wanted to learn from them or trade for their work. But women's work was also invisible in certain ways, taken for granted because it was constant, necessary, unglamorous. A man could gain status through a single successful hunt, could return to camp with meat and receive immediate recognition, immediate reward, immediate elevation in the community's eyes. A woman gained status through years of consistent, skillful labor, through the accumulation of countless small acts of competence that kept her family alive and comfortable. Her recognition came slowly, quietly, without ceremony or public acknowledgement, and yet her contribution was no less vital to survival. And in winter, when that labor intensified, when hides needed constant repair because the cold made leather brittle, when children needed constant care because illness spread quickly in close quarters, when the fire needed constant feeding because letting it die meant death, women bore a particular burden. Their hands were always busy, always working, always engaged in the endless tasks that made life possible. There were women who managed this burden better than others, who had more help, more resources, and this created subtle hierarchies even within the realm of women's work. An older woman with grown daughters who could assist her, who could take over some of the endless tasks, had an advantage that a young mother with small children could not match. A woman married to a successful hunter, a woman whose skills were in high demand, and who could trade her work for additional resources, a woman with living parents who could help care for grandchildren. These women had advantages. But they also had obligations because skill and status meant you were expected to teach, to help, to share your knowledge with younger women or those less fortunate. Children, in winter, occupied a unique position. They were the future, the continuation of the people, and as such, they were protected, prioritized when food was scarce, kept close to the fire, even if it meant adults slept in colder spaces. But they were also vulnerable, more susceptible to cold and illness, and their survival was never guaranteed. Parents made hard calculations in winter, how much food to give each child, how to distribute warmth when there wasn't enough for everyone, which child was strong enough to endure a little more hardship so that a weaker sibling might survive. These were not choices anyone wanted to make, but winter forced them, and families lived with the consequences. A mother might give the warmest sleeping spot to a sickly child, while a robust one slept nearer the teepee's edge where cold crept in. And there were always those on the margins, people without family, without a clear role, who depended on the community's generosity. Widows whose husbands had died in hunts or battles, orphans whose parents had succumbed to disease or accident, the disabled who could not contribute labor in traditional ways, the elderly who had outlived their children and found themselves alone in a world that required family to survive. These people were particularly vulnerable in winter. In a good year, when resources were sufficient and the buffalo had been plentiful and the stored food seemed adequate, they were cared for, brought into the circle, given what they needed. Someone would bring them meat, someone would repair their teepee, someone would check their fire to ensure they would not freeze. But in a bad year, when everyone was struggling, when the buffalo had not come, and the stored food was running out and every family was calculating how long they could survive, in those years the marginal people suffered most. The social contract held, but it was tested, stretched thin, bent under the weight of collective desperation. And there were times when it bent far enough that difficult choices had to be made, choices about who received help and who did not. These choices were not made lightly, and they left scars, psychological, social, spiritual wounds that persisted long after the physical danger had passed. There is a story, passed down through oral tradition, of a winter so harsh that a band had to leave behind an elderly woman who could no longer walk. Her legs had failed, her body had weakened beyond recovery, and carrying her meant the entire band would move too slowly to reach safety before their food ran out. They left her in a sheltered place with a small fire that would burn for a few hours, and what food they could spare from their own meager supplies, and they moved on because to stay meant everyone would die. The woman died, as everyone knew she would, as she herself knew she would, but the story remembers her, honors her sacrifice, and mourns the necessity that made it required. This is the darker side of winter privilege and survival, the knowledge that not everyone could be saved, that sometimes love meant letting go. But the story also emphasizes that the decision was made with grief, not coldness, that the woman's memory was preserved in the oral tradition, which is its own form of honoring, its own way of saying that her life mattered even as circumstances forced its end. Winter, then, revealed both the strength of social bonds and their limits. It showed who had resources and who did not, but it also showed that those resources were fragile, that privilege was relative, that everyone was, in the end, at the mercy of forces larger than themselves, the weather, the movement of game animals, the unpredictable spirits that governed the natural world. The chief, with his warm teepee, could still lose everything if the buffalo did not come. The medicine person with sacred robes could still die if illness struck and no remedy proved effective, if the spirits withdrew their protection for reasons no human could understand. The great hunter could still freeze if the storm caught him, if the wind shifted suddenly and snow fell so thick he could not see his own hands, if cold penetrated his clothing and stopped his heart before he could find his way back to camp. And so, privilege in winter was always tempered by humility, by the knowledge that survival was never individual but always communal, never guaranteed but always precarious. The elite, such as they were, understood that their position was contingent on their service, that they were only as strong as the community they served. A chief without followers was just a man sitting alone in a tipi, his status meaningless if no one acknowledged it. And the community, for its part, understood that some roles required protection, that investing in leaders and healers and skilled individuals was an investment in collective survival. Keeping the chief healthy meant having someone who could make difficult decisions when consensus failed. Keeping the medicine person safe meant maintaining the spiritual connection that gave life meaning beyond mere physical existence. Keeping the hunter strong meant having someone who could provide when all else failed. This balance between individual privilege and communal need, between hierarchy and equality, between service and entitlement, was delicate, constantly negotiated, and winter was the season when it was most tested. The long nights and scarce resources created situations where every decision had consequences, where every choice about distribution of food or warmth or shelter had to be weighed against competing needs and limited supplies. When spring finally came, when the snow melted and the world softened and green grass pushed through dead earth, these tensions often eased. Abundance returned, or at least the promise of abundance, and the calculations of winter became less urgent, less painful, less fraught with life and death significance. But they did not disappear because the memory of winter remained. People remembered who had shared and who had hoarded, who had served and who had failed, who had survived and who had not, and how each person had behaved during the hardest times. These memories shaped the social order for the rest of the year, influenced who was chosen to lead, who was trusted, who was valued. A man who had been generous in winter earned respect that carried through the easy months. A woman who had helped others when she herself was struggling gained status that could not be taken away. Winter, in this sense, was not just a season, but a social crucible, a time when the true nature of relationships was revealed and refined. It stripped away the superficial, the performative, the merely polite, and showed who people really were when survival was on the line and comfort was a distant memory. And through it all, there was the fire. In every tipi, whether it belonged to a chief or a commoner, a medicine person or a hunter, a skilled woman or a struggling widow, in every tipi there was a fire burning in the center, smoke rising through the opening at the top, warmth radiating outward to push back the cold that pressed against the buffalo hide walls. And that fire was tended by someone, fed by someone, watched over by someone through the long, cold night. The fire did not care who you were, what status you held, what privileges you enjoyed, what accomplishments you had achieved in warmer seasons. It simply burned, or it did not. And whether you slept warm or cold depended not on your position, but on whether someone kept the fire alive, someone who stayed awake while others slept, someone who added wood at the right moment, someone who understood that the fire was life itself and could not be allowed to die. In that sense, winter was the ultimate democracy, a season that rendered all human distinctions temporary, all hierarchies provisional, all lives equally dependent on the same basic elements: fire, shelter, food, and the willingness to endure. The chief's fire needed the same attention as the widow's fire. The medicine person's tipi grew cold as quickly as the hunter's if no one tended the flames. And in the darkest part of winter, when the cold was so intense that breath froze in the air and exposed skin burned with the touch of wind, when the sun barely rose above the horizon and darkness claimed 20 hours of every day, In those times, everyone understood that survival was both a collective effort and an individual responsibility. You depended on others for your life, and others depended on you for theirs. And this mutual dependence was not a weakness, but the very foundation of existence. The privilege that some enjoyed, the small comforts and advantages that made survival more bearable, existed within this framework of interdependence. They were not separations from the community, but expressions of the community's needs. The need for leadership, for spiritual guidance, for skilled labor, for successful hunting. And because these privileges served the whole, they were tolerated, even celebrated, as long as they were exercised with responsibility and generosity. But when privilege became exploitation, when those with advantages used them only for personal benefit and ignored their obligations to the community, the system broke down and everyone suffered. Winter would not tolerate such breakdown for long. The season was too harsh, too unforgiving, too absolute in its demands to allow selfishness or abandonment of communal bonds. And so the people learned, generation after generation, how to balance individual achievement with collective welfare, how to recognize and reward skill while ensuring that no one was left to freeze alone. They learned these lessons in winter, when the consequences of failure were immediate and fatal, and they carried them forward into the rest of the year. The stories told around winter fires, the decisions made in cold council meetings, the acts of generosity and sacrifice that marked the hardest months, all of these became part of the cultural memory, the shared understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that was beautiful and terrible by turns. And when the next winter came, as it always did, the people remembered and prepared and endured, knowing that spring would follow, knowing that they would survive together or not at all, knowing that in the space between the cold outside and the fire within, their humanity was both tested and affirmed. And so we come to the end of this quiet journey, this drifting exploration through the frozen nights of another time. We have walked, in our imaginations, through the daily struggles of ordinary people, the endless gathering of firewood, the negotiation between smoke and cold, the restless sleep on hard ground. We have followed Black Elk through his childhood winters, watched him grow from a shivering boy to a man shaped by cold and vision, someone who learned that survival required both physical endurance and spiritual strength. We have touched the mysteries that remain, the questions about warmth that artifacts cannot fully answer, the technologies and techniques that worked but whose exact nature we can only partly reconstruct. And we have seen how, even in relatively egalitarian societies, winter created distinctions, how privilege and responsibility were intertwined, how survival was both individual and communal. What strikes most deeply, perhaps, is the simple fact of endurance. Generation after generation, people faced winters that would kill us in hours if we were unprepared, and they not only survived but created rich cultures, complex spiritual systems, sophisticated technologies. They did this without the tools we take for granted. No synthetic insulation, no central heating, no weather forecasts, no grocery stores stocked with food, shipped from warmer climates. They had only what they could make, what they could carry, what they could remember and teach. And it was enough, barely enough, but enough. There is something both humbling and inspiring in this. We live in an age where warmth is assumed, where winter is an inconvenience rather than a life-threatening ordeal, where we control our environment with the turn of a dial. But this comfort has come at a cost. We have lost touch with the knowledge that sustained people for millennia, lost the skills that once meant the difference between life and death. We no longer know how to read the sky for signs of coming storms, how to tan a hide or build a fire in the wind. We no longer understand cold the way those people understood it, as a constant presence, a force to be respected, negotiated with, endured. And in losing that knowledge, we have lost something of ourselves, some connection to the resilience and ingenuity that define our species. But we can still honor that past, can still learn from it. We can recognize that the warmth we enjoy was built on the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, that every technological advance, from the simple tipi liner to modern insulation, represents someone's hard-won understanding of how to survive. We can appreciate in this moment the extraordinary achievement of simply being warm, of sleeping through a winter night without fear. We can look back at those people who huddled around small fires in hide shelters and feel not pity, but admiration, not superiority, but kinship. They were us, separated only by time and circumstance. They loved and feared and hoped just as we do. They watched their children sleep and prayed for spring just as any parent would. They felt the cold and fought against it, and in doing so, they proved something essential about human nature, that we adapt, we persist, we find ways to endure even when survival seems impossible. So as you drift towards sleep now in your warm bed, in your climate-controlled room, spare a thought for those winter nights on the plains, those people wrapped in buffalo robes, tending fires through darkness. Think of them not as distant historical figures, but as human beings, as alive and present in their moment as you are in yours. Feel gratitude for the warmth you have, yes, but also feel a connection to that long chain of survival, that unbroken line of people who endured winter after winter, so that eventually someone, perhaps you, could sleep warm and safe. The fire they tended is not entirely gone. It burns still, transformed in the systems that heat our homes, in the knowledge that insulates our walls, in the memory we carry of what it meant to fight the cold, and in remembering we keep something of their warmth alive, so rest now. Let the story settle into your mind like snow falling gently on silent plains. Let the images fade, the smoke rising from winter camps, the faces lit by firelight, the endless white expanse of frozen landscape. Let yourself drift as those people drifted into sleep, exhausted by the day's labor, lulled by the rhythm of the fire's crackling, trusting that tomorrow the sun will rise, the fire will be rekindled, and life will continue. Sleep well in your warmth. And in sleeping, honor all those who fought for theirs, night after long winter night, under stars that have not changed, in a cold that has not softened, across centuries that separate us but cannot sever the fundamental connection of shared humanity. The winter nights of the past are over. Your warm night is here now. Rest easy.